Welcome, Democrats and Republicans. It's ironic that it's this week. It turns out this week that we're talking about this. That wasn't my intention to do it on voting week, but it's a very good time to talk about the history of why we're voting, how this worked out, how did the colors happen, what's up with the animals, etc., etc., etc. By the end of today, you are going to be much smarter than you were to start with, but I will say as a precursor, pretty much everything I'm going to say today I've learned in the past 2 weeks. So I am by no means an expert, and it is possible I will get something wrong. So I'm planning to not just send this class video, but also the PowerPoint and some other videos to your parents' email today, so that if you're interested in this, you can dig deeper and farther and go as far as you want to go, all the way back to 1776. Okay, you ready for this? You have a worksheet in front of you that actually looks like a regular school worksheet instead of super fun pictures of people with big hair. That should tell you something. First question, I want you to make a guess. What state out of all the states in the Union do you think has voted Democrat most times? What state?
1820. State.
State, yeah.
Oh.
California? California?
Texas.
Texas?
New York.
New York? You can't guess because you know.
Oh, Connecticut.
Connecticut. It's Georgia. Yeah, like I said, rabbit hole, what on earth? What on earth? How is this even possible? So I hope that tells you, wow, I really need this class because I am so confused. Georgia is the most Democrat state out of all the states in the Union. Okay, so we're going to start with the beginning. To really understand the Democratic and Republican parties, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning, as in George Washington kind of beginning. Now, we're not going all the way back to the Pilgrims because there was no actual republic at that point. When did America become an official independent country? As in, like, the Constitution? Thank you, Priscilla. 1776, of course. But to do that, you have to make a bunch of decisions, and you have to unify all these groups of people who have different ideas about things. Now, there's so much I want to tell you about the biblical history of our country. I'm gonna take 5 minutes and do it anyway. When the Pilgrims came, the Geneva Bible, there's a picture in I think it's in the Capitol building, where there's that rotunda and there's all these huge paintings, and there's one of the Pilgrims who came, and they're praying, they're thanking God for bringing them safely over. In the one man's lap is an open Bible, and the words in the open Bible are specifically there so that you know that this is a Geneva Bible. The reason that's significant is the Geneva Bible was recently translated before they came over. When did they come over? 16. Oh man, we need to do a real history class here. Okay, so the Pilgrims came over in the 1600s. They landed on Plymouth Rock. They started these little colonies. It wasn't just the Pilgrims. There were plenty of other people. When they start talking about the gold diggers and stuff, we're not talking about the Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims came over to have the freedom to worship God. Because where they came from, the Church of England was telling them exactly what to believe and exactly how to worship. And they didn't like that. So they left. They were being persecuted. They left so they could have a free place to worship God. That's how America got started. When they came over, they had recently gotten the Geneva Bible. History of printing presses, history of translations. The Catholic Church didn't want them to be able to read the Bible for themselves. They kept it in Latin, and they said only the priest can really understand what the Bible has to say, so you need to just listen to the priest, which opened the door for a lot of corruption. So this was an English translation of the Bible that they had. So they were studying this as a rule book for life. It wasn't just like, oh, the Bible, I'll read it because it's got nice stories about Jesus in it. No, this was like law giving, the word of God. This is how we want to live and how we want to create this new world that we're going to. So they studied it for hours every day to learn rules about life. When they got to America, they actually started a socialistic society where everybody had the same. And as nice as that sounds, it doesn't leave room for the fact that corruption and injustice are always with us. Some people figured out pretty quick that they could just be lazy and do nothing and still get as much as everybody else. Same problem we're dealing with today. Same problem with people taking advantage of things. Well, they read in the scriptures, if a man does not work, he should not eat. They were like, oh. So they changed the socialistic society into a non-socialistic society and said, if you don't work, you don't get your share. They also read that how can a man take care of the church of God if he hasn't taken care of his own house? They were like, whoa, wait a minute, we're busy taking care of everybody. We need to take care of our own. And that's why they changed the rules about a man being in charge of working for himself, working for his own family, being responsible for his part of the world. And so the society that started this did such a good job, and it made such a difference that the colony up in Jamestown, I believe, said, whoa, hey, we want to do that too. And they stopped being socialistic and started doing a society based on biblical principles as well. There's a lot more to that, but that's not what we came here to study, so we're going to move on. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to turn the light on. Now, 1776 is when the Constitution came out. So there's a war for independence. America wants to be its own country, free from Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who's the first president? Thank you. I hope you know that. But you'll notice, I'm going to show you the big picture all the way from 1789, which is the first one, all the way up to 2000, so that you can see this general idea about colors. In the video, it's just not good. Can you go ahead and turn the light off again? We'll have to sacrifice. Okay, there's a bunch of colors down here. These were all the different political parties in the beginning. We had tons of different parties, tons of different belief systems and standards and who wants to do what and all this kind of stuff. You don't need to know about most of them, but obviously you need to know what purple is. And get this, I love this, the irony of this. It's not the Democratic Party. It's not the Republican Party. It's the Democratic Republican Party. Well, that solves everything, doesn't it? So obviously that's what was going on here in the beginning, except for these guys, the first two. And that party was George Washington. Okay. Because there wasn't a party. There wasn't a thing at that point. It's a brand new country. And the way it worked was they voted for these candidates, and the one who got the most votes was the president, and the one who got the second most votes was the vice president. So there you have it. So after a couple of these, we start getting some different ideas. The Federalist one you need to know because it's orange. Now what they believed, you can go home and look that up yourself. This purple one is the Democratic Republican Party. You notice there is no Democratic or Republican individual parties at this point. Okay, what happens next? Okay, we're starting at the bottom and we're going to the top. So 1824, again, all purple. Now also the thing you need to remember, these are the only states that exist. So when you think of America in history, don't think of California, America. Think of this little bitty batch of whatevers. Now, look at that. In 1828, something changed significantly, and we have blue all over the place. Now, blue is for the Democratic Party. The Republican Party didn't exist yet. How the Democratic Party came to be, I'm going to tell you, and especially the donkey part. Okay, now we got blue, blue and green. So again, we're stuck in this thing for a while, and then voila, shazam, here comes the red. This is when the Republican Party was invented, or whatever you want to call it, and now suddenly things are changing. Now this next one, look, different colors. Oh my goodness, what's going on? Anybody know what happened in 1861?
The division of
The Civil War. So now we have seceding states, we have different political parties that people are making up their own stuff. It's a big, chaotic mess. When that is over in 64, so this is black, they're just really mad. 68, now look at America. America is spreading and expanding, but it's got this big middle that doesn't even exist. Texas isn't even part of it at this point. There's non-Americans living in Texas. But you notice from this point on, all you see is red and blue. So when you think of Republicans and Democrats, you're only talking about post-Civil War America. That's important. And post-Civil War, red and blue, red and blue, red and blue, and there's some weird little orange, yellow stuff over there. That's a different thing, and some gray, but that's a different thing as well. So you'll notice the parts of the country tend to be consistently one way or the other. Particularly the South, blue. That's Democrat. Democrat. Okay, this whole thing is Democrat, Southern Democrat, except for this little guy right here, and Florida. But, you know, Florida, he's kind of the oddball. What in the world? What happened? You're going to find out. Okay, now, we continue on. Even into the 50s, some of your parents and grandparents, Democrat. What? What? So now the South is like, we're just going to flip over right here. 64. Anybody remember what happened in the 60s that was significant? Yep.
The missile crisis.
The missile crisis, that was significant. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Was the big thing in the 60s. They're not sitting on the back of the bus anymore. The what?
Big hair.
That's true. I'm thinking more politically speaking. The civil rights movement happened in the 60s, and that kind of switched things with our country and people and things they were thinking about as well. So remember that, because we're going to get to that. And then it keeps going, and we'll get to some of that later. And then all of a sudden, the South is red. Oh, well, now it's purple. Whatever. Red. Now we're blue again. Now we're red. Now we're red, red, blue, red. Oh, my goodness. Where's the consistency? Okay, we need to go back to the beginning. The very beginning. This is the first election. This is all that there is to America. That's it. The colonies, as they were called. It wasn't called America, just the colonies. George Washington won unanimously, so that was that. He was his own political party. Now, these were all the people who were the candidates, but he won, big time. And John Adams was the vice president. Who was the second president?
John Adams.
Adams, okay. So, second election, again, it was whoever they voted for the most. People voted for two, and whoever got the most votes was the president, and whoever got the second most was the vice president. So we got Washington and Adams again. I'm just trying to imagine what it would be like in an election when you have George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson running against each other. We're all like, ooh, hero, but they're all battling it out. Can you imagine? You may. Okay, now I got to talk about this guy, because this is around the time when the Democratic Party was invented, or whatever you want to call it. Now I got to read some stuff, because like I said, I'm no expert on this. Whew. This is so interesting. Does anybody know who that guy is on the far right?
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson, that is correct. If you're filling out your paper, the state that voted Democrat the most is Georgia, as you know. All right. In the beginning, there were kind of two main thought ideas. Thomas Jefferson and his group were large central government kind of people. Again, stuff we're still arguing about today. Heavy government involvement, a national bank, that sort of thing. And their thing, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, they were about the people who should vote should be the landowners. So the rich guys who owned land, they were the ones who were educated and whatever, and apparently they were the ones who should decide about what happens in our country. That was the idea, and of course they were all white. Okay, Alexander Hamilton, maybe I'm backwards. I think Jefferson was the one that was small. Pardon me. Okay. Washington, Adams, and Hamilton were big government. Thomas Jefferson and his group and Andrew Jackson were not big government. They were small government. They thought more about states' rights. They thought more about independence. And their big thing was, we don't want to create another little England. Because that's the way England ran at that point. Yes. You can't do this. Yes. We want to be different. So, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, he didn't set out to start the Democratic Party. That wasn't his goal. He just had a different idea of the way Americans should be run. Now, Thomas Jefferson, if you remember, is the guy who wrote the Constitution, as in literally. The original Constitution that he wrote, just so you know, because this is important later on, originally had no slavery. As in, we don't believe in that. As in, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that all men are created equal, and slavery is not part of that. He was convinced to change his writing of the Constitution because the slave states would never have gone for it, and there would have been no union, and therefore there would not have been the United States of America. And so he backed off and made it more nebulous in the hopes that it would die out on its own, but then we would still have the Union. So the compromise about slavery began from the very beginning. Remember that. Because later on throughout the years, when the South would get mad about something, they would threaten to secede. It was kind of a habit with them. That'll show up later. So now, Andrew Jackson is part of this. All right. Whew. So Hamilton, he wants a big, strong central government. He doesn't really want democracy for everybody. He wants democracy for the landowners. But again, democracy is a brand new idea anyway. This is a big deal. Even if they had just decided on that, it still would have been a big deal. All right. It was a lot like England, where we came from, But Jefferson and Madison and Jackson were like, no, we don't want this. They wanted to expand it. They wanted all people to have the right to vote. Now, their definition of all people was all white guys. But it was still a big, huge jump. It's not just the ones who own land. It's every guy has the right to decide on their rulers. Okay, so Andrew Jackson starts pushing this in the 1820s. The Democratic Party, when it became this thing, was the most democracy the world had ever seen. So again, you remember, don't look at then in reference to now. So people now are like, oh, they were so prejudiced and so whatever, whatever. This was the most, like, free society the world had ever seen. It was huge. But Andrew Jackson, this dude here, he also believed in manifest destiny. And what that is you think God has ordained you to this place. And so it's okay to kick out the Indians and whatever, whatever, because we belong here. He had a few things to learn. So when he got into power, it was the time of the Indian Removal Act, which if you've heard about the Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee and the others had to walk really long time, a lot of people died. It was really tragic. It was very, very sad. So that was not a good thing. Okay. So Jackson was the beginning of the actual Democratic Party, and he was the first guy to run. At this point, it was uncouth to campaign for yourself. Vote for me, vote for me. It's like, that's so uncivilized. But he won, and he vetoed all kinds of things because he didn't like big government. So he took a bunch of power away from the government, and that's when the image of the donkey came into existence. Political cartoons have been used for a very long time, and they often make very good points. The donkey was used for Andrew Jackson because it was a jack, and it was very stubborn. And so it represented him as being extremely stubborn, and that's where the Democratic donkey came from. Still stubborn. All right. Okay, so moving on from Jackson and his cool hair. Now, we're up to 1796. Now we've got Adams and Jefferson, who, remember, they're not on the same side, but one's the president and one's the vice president, so I bet they had some really great conversations. But there's all these other people. Wowzers. So things are getting a little mixed up. Moving on to 1800. Now Jefferson is the president, and he's the Democratic Republican Party, which I'm not sure what that actually means. You can look that up, but it was probably a mix of both. And then there was the Federalist Party, and you can look up what they care about. Okay, 1804. The whole country is pretty unified on Jefferson, and we're still Democratic Republican. So this is the beginning of 1800s before the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party gets invented, things change, things change, things change. Now we're jumping up to 1856. Now this one is significant because it's leading up to the war between the states. Things simmered for a long time before they finally blew up. There was a bunch of issues, lots of issues. And slavery was an issue in the states the entire time. The Missouri Compromise was a big deal. There were laws about this, that, and the other. I want to explain. In 1854, one of the big issues was should slavery extend to the West or not. So at this point, they're making laws about slave states and non-slave states. As in, we're going to open this state, and it's going to be a slave state or not. That's what the government is saying at this point. And people are getting upset, obviously, because there were northern laws and southern laws, and there was issues, and again, lots of compromises, and some really weird things went on. But you can see that the country is divided. But there's red for the first time. The Republican Party came into power. You need to know about the Republicans, what they mean. The Republican Party came into existence by abolitionists. I need to explain. The North being non-slavery did not mean the North was all full of abolitionists who thought slavery was morally wrong. Some of the issue with some of the Northern industrialists, so the Northerns were usually industrialists, the Southerns were often farmers relying on cotton. The Northern industrialists, as things went to spread out west, they wanted their farmers to be able to go out west and be able to succeed. And their concern was if they made it a slave state, your regular farmer who didn't have slaves couldn't compete with a plantation owner who had 200 workers who were doing free labor. So there was a competition thing. It was about business and about money, which it often really is. Okay, that's important. Now, the slavery thing, which Jefferson thought would die out, didn't die out. It almost did, sort of. They had gotten down to about 1 million slaves. And then this dude named Eli Whitney, who was at his friend's plantation, got this idea and he invented this thing called the cotton gin. Cotton wasn't a very lucrative product because it was so time consuming and labor intensive. And so it was kind of like, well, this will die out after a while because the South can't function this way for very long. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, all of a sudden it was an invention that made it super efficient, super easy, super like, ooh, y'all, we can be rich now. We need more slaves. And the slaves jumped up, I think in about 20 years' time, from 1 million to 4 million. Huge. And so all of a sudden, this thing, the North industry was like, well, this will die out, it'll be okay. And now the South is just like booming cotton and all that kind of stuff. But there's still issues of money on both sides. They don't like each other, etc. Okay. So, the abolitionists, however, it wasn't about money. It was about the rights of mankind and about the way God created us all equal. And so they spent their time trying to convince other people that slavery was morally wrong. It was against what the Bible says. It was against God, and we have to stop it. So they created this party, the Republican Party, as an anti-slavery party. The first time a Republican ran, he lost. The second Republican to run was a man named Abraham Lincoln. Now, you need to understand about this. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the beginning. He was kind of in the middle when it came to slavery. He was kind of in the middle on a lot of things, honestly. But the South saw him as an abolitionist. Now we're talking laws, not individual people. The South saw him as an abolitionist, and the South said, if he gets the presidency, we're leaving. Now this wasn't the first time they'd done this, but this time they're like, we really mean it this time. If Lincoln wins, we secede. That was the idea. Now, something I want to explain right here and right now. When you're talking about the war between the states, and somebody says, how did this happen? Why did this happen? You have as many answers as you have people. Because, again, there are individuals involved. There's a difference, though, between an individual reason and a historical reason. There are factors that go into a historical reason, and sometimes the factors are hugely important, sometimes they're very small. So, for example, why did people fight in the Civil War? Well, they all had their own reasons. There were people in the South and the North who were bored at home and thought it would be an adventure because it was supposed to be over in 3 months. So they were like, this will be fun. I'll go shoot at somebody and it'll be great. And obviously it didn't turn out that way. There were some who did it for the money. There were some who did it because they were forced to, like a lot of the slaves in the South. There were some who did it for moral reasons. Do you know the hymn, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah? Mine has a scene, the glory of the coming of the Lord. If I remember correctly, you should look this up because I'm not 100% sure, but that was an abolitionist song. The second verse talks about Jesus, and it says, as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. That's where that song came from. They sang it because they were willing to give their lives to set the slaves free. Nowadays, we sing it, as he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free, but that's not the original words. Look it up yourself, because I might not be perfectly right about that. But an individual's reason to go and fight, for a lot of the Southerners, they fought because of states' rights. They fought to protect their homelands. Robert E. Lee was actually offered to lead the entire Union Army, which would have made the Civil War over in 6 months probably because he was such a brilliant general. And he said, I am more loyal to my state than I am to the Union, so whatever my state, Virginia, decides, that is what I will do. His state was the last one to decide because it's right there in the middle, and they seceded. And that is how Robert E. Lee became the general of the South, the Southern Confederate States. And so for him, the war was about states' rights, protecting your own country, not being invaded by the North. For a lot of people, it was about money. For a lot of people, there were a million reasons. About 500,000 people died in our country fighting each other. Families were split about it. It was horrible because there were some families in the South where the one son was like, they're coming to my homeland, I'm protecting it. And the other son said, slavery is wrong and I'm willing to die for it. And he had to go up and fight, and they might have met each other on the battlefield. It was a really, really bad time. It was a very, very difficult time for a country. However, if you read Little House on the Prairie from Minnesota, they heard about the war between the states. And it was just something like, what? Because they were way over here. So it wasn't all the states. It was just these guys. Very, very interesting. Okay, so moving on from that, this is the election of Abraham Lincoln. He defeated 3 other candidates, but as you can see, it wasn't like a landslide at all. So now here's this blue thing. That is the Southern Democratic Party. So they created a brand new party for the South because they want to do their own thing. Then you got this little weird thing in the middle. You got one Democratic state, and then you got the Republicans up north and out in California. That's ironic. So that's how Lincoln got elected. It was close. It was not a super awesome, everybody thinks Abraham Lincoln is the best thing in the world. In fact, a lot of people hated his guts, north and south. So 7 states seceded between his election and his inauguration. It was just like, boom, we're out. And that's how this all got started. Legally speaking, that's how it all got started. Because Lincoln was what they thought of as an abolitionist, and he was not going to support them, what the South wanted, and therefore they were done. Okay, moving on. 1880. So now we're past the war, and as you can see, the country's still very split. It's not like winning the war fixed everything. It just made the South not secede. Yes?
What's the stripe?
The stripe is a mix. So they're a little bit one and they're a little bit the other. So it was split between the two as far as electoral votes, which is interesting. Hancock got 5 electoral votes and Garfield got 1. I don't know how that worked, but there's some numbers involved here. But as you can see, the North and the South are sticking to their guns. They're stubborn and, you know, there it is. Oh, and the North, well, not the North, but the Republican Party got its elephant. Now, how did the Republicans get to be elephants? The dude who drew cartoons and political cartoons and a bunch of other drawings, who is the reason we have our American concept of Santa Claus, because he drew that as well. He drew this big elephant in a political cartoon because the Republican Party was known for being very strong and kind of bowling over everything. They were strong this and strong this and big government and protect the businesses and all this, you know, bowling and Chinese style. So they drew it as an elephant, and we've been an elephant ever since, or they've been an elephant ever since. Okay, now, 1904. Theodore Roosevelt comes into office. As you can see, Theodore Roosevelt is a Republican, and by far, the vast majority of the states are Republican at this point. The South is entirely Democrat, so it's still very split in its political views, its desires, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what does the Democratic Party stand for and what does the Republican Party stand for? Don't assume then is the same as now. So let's talk about that. All right. Whew. Now we're down to 2 parties. Remember at the beginning there were all these different parties? Yes.
Who was the guy that did that political cartoon about Yeltsin?
Oh, his name was Naus, I believe, N-A-U-S. You can look him up. The guy who drew Santa Claus. He did some really interesting political cartoons. Okay, so 1896 was the election that changed the presidency and campaigns and all that whole election thing. 90% of people came to this election. That's a very big deal, so obviously the people cared. There was a record high campaign cost, so now we're spending more money on it. It ended the third-party system, so now we're down to these big 2 for the most. And it realigned the parties. That's significant as well. Now, for the next 16 years, the Republican Party is going to dominate politics. They kind of take over, but the South is going to be very stubborn and stick with their Democrat side. They call it the solid South. And if you look at those 16 years, it's like blue, 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 blue. In 1912, that run was stopped by Woodrow Wilson. He didn't win because most of the country liked him. He won because there was a break between the Republicans and that whole third party thing, like Perot, you know. But since then, since Truman, who was the president when I hope you know because we talked about him, since then, pretty much America kind of switches every 2 terms. They just swing back and forth. We're like, well, this isn't working out, so let's try this guy. Oh, well, this isn't working out, let's try this. And so it just, and we're pretty predictable even though we think we aren't. All right, so taking a look between 1896 and 1932. So that's a big stretch of over 30 years. This is what America looked like. If you notice, the Deep South voted exactly the same every single time. Every time. Then there's all these others out here. There were certain ones that voted Republican every single time. This tells you about that, but you'll get the PowerPoint, so if you want to look into that some more, it's very interesting. Now, 1952. So here we are. Most of the country is Republican, except for the South. This astonishes me that this is 1952. This is not that long ago. They voted for Eisenhower, and the South voted for Stevenson, whoever he is. And that was the way it stayed. Just so you know, this was kind of consistent. If you remember looking at the whole ones, this was pretty much the way America went for a very, very long time. But then things sort of changed. This is really weird. And I'd like you to study it on your own because I'm still not 100% sure about it. But it seems like the Great Depression was a big shift in philosophical things. So you've got the Democrats who are more about social justice, which is still what they're more about, and the Republicans who are more about what Republicans are about. In about the 30s, in the Great Depression, okay, the Republican Party is the reason slavery was abolished, pretty much. But around the 30s, when the Depression happened and FDR came into power, and FDR was more like, we're going to give you stuff, a lot of the African-American community, who was still very, very poor post-Civil War, because a lot of the country was still very prejudiced, whether they, fought in the war or not, so they were having a hard time. And a lot of them shifted to the Democratic Party because it was more what they wanted. And somewhere somebody even said, turn your picture of Abraham Lincoln to the wall so he can't see you switch sides. So that was a shift in our country, a demographic shift, a philosophical shift from loyalties of one to the other. Now remember that because that's going to matter in the 60s. So in 52, this is still where we're at. In 1980, this was Reagan. Pretty much the whole country wanted Reagan. Georgia didn't. But in the 60s, one of the things that happened was the civil rights and some of these other social justice changes. The Southern people in general tended to kind of think that the Democrats had gone too far. So they had been staunchly Democrat all this time, and then they were like, wait a minute, y'all, this isn't really what we want. We don't want you to be so far over here. And so the white Southern groups started switching to the Republican Party because the Republican Party started representing more of what they cared about. Interesting. By the 80s, this happened. And since the 80s, the South has been pretty much as red as it can possibly be. And very stubbornly and staunchly so. And most of them, I imagine, would probably be surprised to learn all this stuff. Now, all the stuff I said about the Democrats, the philosophy, you may disagree with me, that's fine. Do some more studying. I tried to find the facts that I could find to give you enough information so that you can go and study on your own. The year 2000 was the election that changed things. The reason this one was important was this was when the red and the blue happened. Okay, make sure I get all this stuff. Okay. This one was extremely interesting. Now, y'all are very used to the whole, it's going to take 7 years to count all these votes, even though they're all on computer. That's kind of weird. But that's kind of the way our elections work now. There's corruption and weirdness and all that kind of stuff. But at the time, there were, literal pieces of paper. And somebody's literally counting the pieces of paper. So the year 2000 was George Bush against Al Gore. Very close race. Extremely close race. It all came down to Florida. Well, George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, was the governor in Florida. So everybody's like, ha, 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 that's going to work. But everybody's like, no, Florida's more progressive. And, Al Gore was super mega climate change. And he claimed that he invented the internet and all this kind of stuff. It was a very, very interesting guy. George Bush was about as Republican as you can get. He's like, give me my gun, give me my farm, give me my freedom. Don't mess with us. We're the Republicans. And so it was just, it was almost to the point of being stereotypical. There was this stereotypical Republican, there was a stereotypical Democrat, and the whole country was like, oh. And it was so split that Florida, they called Florida for Al Gore. And then they were like, oh, wait, sorry, we're wrong. And then they're like, we think it's Bush. And then they're like, oh, wait, sorry. Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, wait. We don't know what's going on. And it was chaos. And it went on for days and days and days and days and days and days and days. And they were talking about hanging chads and dimpled chads because the bulletins had these little things that you stuck, you poked the one you wanted. And it was like, well, some of them, the little thing didn't quite come off. And so we aren't sure if that counted. And some of them, it was just a little dink. And so we aren't sure if it's a real vote or not. It was just this nonsense. So the news is going 24 hours a day about this stuff, showing these people holding up these things, I can't tell which one's Pope's. It was really horrible if it hadn't been our nation's future that was on the line. In the end, they say George Bush apparently won by about 500 votes. How many people do we have in our country? Like 230 million. And it came down to about 500 votes. So you can start a really good argument about this one pretty much with any group of people that you want to. So what happened as far as the red and blue? Before that, red, blue, green, yellow, didn't really matter what color you picked for whatever side. It's usually red and blue because those are kind of American colors. But a news thing or the newspaper or whoever, they just picked whatever they wanted. And very often they actually picked red for the color that they didn't want. Like during the Cold War, who wanted to be red? That was the color of communism. So if you were kind of a woke news station, you would have put the Republicans on the red because you didn't like them. But if you were Fox News, you would have put the Republicans on the blue. In fact, when Reagan won, he was blue. And somebody said something like, the nation looks like a big blue swimming pool or something like that because the colors just changed. One might have this, one might have this. But this cemented it because the election went on for so long, and the newspaper put out a colored map, and it was with the Republicans being red and the Democrats being blue. And so they all kind of coincided with each other because the news was running this 24/7 for days and days and days and days. And that's how it happened. The reason for it, there wasn't really, red for Republican or red for whatever. And somebody just picked it, and that's how it happened. Great historical decision there. Now, the issues of the day. This fascinated me because we think the issues of our day right now are so extremely important, and they are. But if you look back at history, the issues of the day were very different, and they were all extremely important too. But if you go all the way back to 1896, the big issues were the tariffs for silver and gold. I'm not really concerned about that right now. It's not going to define my vote. But at the time, if you're going to California looking for gold, I guess you really care about that. The Spanish-American War, if we were at war with Spain, we'd be very concerned about that. But, the square deal, that was a big deal. Class warfare, okay, the landowners and the non-landowners and all stuff. World War I. Normalcy, remember we talked about that. Prosperity, all this stuff. Very, very, very interesting. What was the big deal at the time? The silent majority, the Nixon scandal, the Cold War, the moral majority. The moral majority was not a huge thing until Reagan. So again, don't think of then as now. The reason these people were Republicans back then is because, they like gun rights and they're like, take this out of my cold dead hands. Well, maybe not. Find out. Study. Okay. Now, if you're kind of like, what's up with the two parties anyway? What do they really believe? At this point in our history, this is a general concept, again, not an individual one, but more of a general big picture. It'd be curious to read through this and think about kind of like, where do you stand? Where does your family stand? Again, I'm going to send this to your home. You can talk to your parents about it, have a very good, interesting discussion, get in a fight about the election in 2000 if you want to, whatever. Okay, so historically, the Democrats, they were traditionally seen as the Southern Party back in the day. They split in the 1912 election, Democrats to the left of Republicans on social and physical issues. So again, the left. That's where the left thing came from. Okay, over time, they got a lot of supporters from the workers in the northern cities. They had regional alliances in 1964. So the civil rights movement changed things. 1912 changed things. Their big stronghold today is the Northeast, the Great Lakes, the West Coast, the urban population, usually the big, big cities. So the states that have really huge cities are very often Democrat. Democrat does stuff that they like. Republican history. It was founded in 1854, right before the war. First president was Abraham Lincoln. It was seen as the Northern Party in the beginning. After the Civil Rights movement, it switched to being a big stronghold in the South, the Great Plains and the Southwest, so the farming country, more salt of the earth, I guess you could say, the more traditionalist. So why is this? What are the values, at least for now, that make people choose one way or the other? And you can decide whether you agree with this list or not. I didn't write it. So the Democrats' beliefs. They are liberal. They like a strong federal government. They like to increase taxes to the wealthy people. Never heard that. Social programs, community and social justice, environmental laws, anti-discrimination laws, education. They favor less increase in military spending. That's a big one. They favor gun control, support by minority groups, Catholics, Hispanics, blacks, etc. They like opportunity and equality. These are their messages that they say they care about, that they're fighting for. Now, the Republicans on the other side. Conservative, fiscally and socially. If you don't know what fiscally means, you can ask somebody. States' rights over federal rights, so it's more independent. Tax cuts, reducing social programs, kind of like more like personal responsibility instead of government responsibility. Laissez-faire for the government, you can look that up. Reliance on private sector as stimulus for economic growth. Instead of the government, like the New Deal, giving economic growth, they think the people should do it. Dominant foreign policy, favor increasing military spending. They oppose gun control laws, and they are the far right, as they are called in this one. Like, I'm over there on the far right. Is pro-religion, anti-bureaucracy, pro-military, pro-business, and pro-personal responsibility, i.e. the Tea Party. And we believe in self-reliance and freedom. So you can look at that and kind of think, if you had just come from a different country, which one would you want to be part of? That was a hypothetical question. But yeah, so it's interesting because some of these things sound, you need to filter everything through the scriptures, but saying you value something and the laws you actually make for that something aren't always the same thing. So if you hear people saying, well, because you're not this, you don't care about people, take a debate class. Learn how to defend what you believe in the right way. And something I just wanted to point out to you. You all live in a culture that is extremely bipartisan, extremely divided. I don't think our country has ever been this divided since the Civil War, as in like 50 here and 50 here. It didn't used to be so much that way. I wanted you to see this, because like in 94, which is not that long ago, so you've got your middle line Democrat and your middle line Republican weren't that far apart. They voted for different parties, but there wasn't this like huge cavern between the two. We can't agree on anything. And even in 2004, look at this. It's pretty close. This is 2014. We're way over here. And so it's like people who are Democrats tend to be more Democrat than they used to be, and people who are Republicans tend to be more Republican than they used to be. And I would guess by 2022, that's an even bigger gap. So again, when you're studying history, don't assume that something in 1960 and somebody says they were a Democrat or Republican, don't assume you know what that means. Ask people. You're doing interviews. Ask people questions. Now, I wish we had another hour for you guys to get together in tables and hash out things like, what would have happened if the South had seceded and they let the South secede and it made its own country? And what would that have done to World War I and World War II? Would we all be Nazis now? What would have happened if, blah, 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 blah. There's so many things we could talk about, discuss, argue about, but we don't have time. So instead, yes, Tina?
Did you mean to be implicit about the homework? Like, we have at least our table has no clue what he's meant for us to go on.
Thank you for asking about that. So if you take a look at your worksheet, basically this worksheet was in it for anybody who's interested in actually studying this. Most of you, I would assume, were just like, wow, that was a lot of information. Yes?
Will the worksheet have many points next week?
I'm afraid not. So there was just information for you to fill out. Actually, if you filled all this out, you can turn this in if you want to, and I'll give you points for it, because that is impressive. The back was kind of an idea. We were going to have a discussion, but we don't have time. So if you fill this out, you're welcome to turn it in and make your names on it. But there is no homework in reference to the worksheet this week. The only homework is you can do interviews if you want, do your poster if you want, and next week is the last week to get any points. So as we finish up with our last 2 minutes, I don't know about you, but my brain is just like, whoa! So I got a few pictures just for fun. A few more from the past. This is a playground. As you can see, people's philosophies about certain things have changed over the years. In 1904, the idea was you need to learn to be resilient, you need to learn to take care of yourself, you need to whatever. And so they were like, don't be stupid, go play. Now, I imagine there were quite a few broken bones and quite a few other injuries, but it was kind of like, deal with it. So you had very strong people. Now remember, these were the ones who were going to be adults during the Great Depression, so it's probably good that they learned a little resilience. Daniel.
There's a person falling in that picture.
That's a swing.
It looks like a fall.
Nowadays, it's like, oh my goodness, the playgrounds have to be plastic because little Johnny might bonk his head and hurt himself. Oh no, take him to the ER. So it kind of makes you wonder what kind of adults this generation's going to be, but that's not my problem. I wanted you to see this. Again, don't think of then in reference to now. Teachers. I'm a teacher. 1901. Have you ever seen those like When Calls the Heart or those sweet little Hallmark movies about the girl who goes to be a teacher in the 1900s and we're going to change kids' lives? Yay! She was single, and here were her rules. Number 1, you may not marry during the term of your contract. Number 2, schoolmistresses shall not keep company with men. 3, you must be home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. The exception shall be to attend proper school functions. 4, you may not loiter downtown in ice cream parlors. Yeah. Bad testimony. Number 5, you may not travel beyond town limits without the written permission of the chairman of the board. Yowzers. 6, schoolmistresses may not ride in any carriage with a man unless he is her father or her brother. Don't ride in carriage with a man. You never know what might happen. 7, you may not smoke or partake of tobacco in any form. 8, you may not wear bright colors. Okay, sorry. I quit. Number 9, you may under no circumstances dye your hair. Ooh. Number 10, schoolmistresses must wear at least 2 petticoats. Schoolmasters shall wear a suit coat and suspenders. Number 11, dresses must not be any shorter than 2 inches above the ankle. 12, to keep the schoolroom neat and clean, you must sweep the floor at least once a day, scrub the floor at least once a week with hot soapy water, clean the blackboards at least once a day, start the fire by 7 a.m. so the room will be warm by 8. Booyah! They didn't get paid very much either. So, anytime you read those stories about those school teachers, you'd be like, wow, you're awesome. So then I guess if you happen to fall in love with somebody without ever talking to them or riding in a carriage with them, you'd have to quit your job to marry him. This is an ankle contest. Very scandalous.
What?
And this policeman is judging the ankles to see who has the prettiest ankles.
And look at his smile.
This was the 20s, y'all. The roaring 20s. Things were really scandalous, and all those poor teachers probably didn't even watch. It was so horrifying. Oh, y'all, I found this, and I was like, I have to tell the kids. During Prohibition, you remember when alcohol was illegal? And the guys were making moonshine in secret, black market and all this stuff? They would actually put hooves on the bottom of their shoes so if they were running away from the police through a field, they couldn't track him. So it brings new meaning to the term, he's really hoofing it. This is a piano for people who are stuck on bed rest. I think that's pretty cool. This was a homeschool. This was one of the first Mickey Mouse Club meetings. Like, is that not one of the creepiest things you've ever seen in your life? This is filming Godzilla. This was a flight in the 1960s.
Wow.
Like, all we get now is peanuts, you know, and pretzels. This was a square dance at high school. This was an electric car in the 70s, so they're not brand new. And that's a guy on top of the World Trade Center fixing the antenna. I can't even look at it. So, enjoy your week, everybody. I will see you next week with your projects and your posters.